e4, c6, and standard play looks like this. You build for the center with your c-pawn, because if they take you, you want to take back like this in the center of the board. So, first we're going to look at the very standard 2 pawns in the center approach. We're going to begin with pushing because this is what's played the most. So, against this pawn wedge, you fight with this move right away. And the whole point is you're trying to actually get them to take you. Why? Because then you're going to develop your knight to c6. And the second this knight gets to f3 to defend this pawn, you throw the bishop out there to pin it. Sometimes the bishop will go to f5, but most times you're going to wait for this move and then play this. You will slowly maximize the pressure on these 2 pawns and then try to take both of them. So your next move is going to be to play something like e6, because now your bishop is not locked in anymore, okay? Then you're going to take this pawn back. If it gets defended, your knight loves to go to f5. It cannot go to f6, so it likes to go to e7, and then after something like this to f5. Now, if you're confused what's going on with this bishop, if this bishop ever gets attacked, you're gonna take, and then this has no defense anymore, because I don't want you to weaken your king so much. There can be like worst case scenarios where you accidentally, let me just show you just a really funny example, leave this whole diagonal open and get hit with this and lose, because now you have to block with the queen and that's bye-bye. So that can happen. You need to stay patient with c5 and when they take you, right? Stay patient, jump the knight out, get this bishop to pin. Now, if they play something like bishop to f4, you might need to go back to plan B of bishop f5 and e6, because if you block in your bishop, that will just be a little bit tragic. Now, I only looked at captures, by the way. If they go here, same game plan. That's the beauty. Same game plan. Knight c6, you wait for the knight, you pin it, and then at some point, you're ready, right? See, knight e7, or you can take, and you go for that pawn. After you take the knight and you take the pawn, this knight pressures the center. You need to go move by move, obviously, whether they've taken you or not, whether they've defended their pawn in the center, but this move c5, in my opinion, forces the issue so quickly and really fights on the pawn structure. They're going to lose both pawns. You're going to have a lot of games you win both those pawns. Just be careful of that diagonal check and try to follow those rules. Other variation, exchange variation. Exchange variation can happen after d4 or whenever. Like, this is also the exchange variation. The point is they play e takes d5. You take back, let me just, well, we can look at it with both pawns in the center. You have multiple game plans here. Get your knights out and actually move them first, because you know they're going to go there. Knight, knight, easy. And then move the bishop out before you block it in with your e-pawn, and then move your dark squared bishop. Super simple game plan. Knight f3, knight c6, knight f6. Bishop, oh, sorry, 2 moves in a row by me by accident. E6, bishop d6. Super simple. However, you have multiple approaches. The exchange variation for white, when they take on d5, is only considered, according to theory, the exchange variation when they put the bishop to d3. There is a little sub-variation here when they actually attack your pawn with this pawn, because they're actually trying to, dislodge you. This is known as the Panov. It's not known as the exchange. And by the way, you can employ much of the similar game plan here, but because this is very demanding on your center, what you can do is actually develop and defend it first, and because you don't want to help white develop. One of my favorite things to do in the exchange variation and in the Panov is to actually fianchetto my bishop to g7. There's actually some variations where white gets to take this pawn for free, but because you get such quick development, again, just like in the advanced variation, these pawns kind of suck. They don't do anything. These pawns can be won very quickly. You can use flank pawn pushes to deflect your opponent's queen and knight, but more than anything else, what I want you to think about here is you have options. You can play this in a fianchetto style, like this, the exchange variation, and then develop your pieces accordingly, and your pressure on the queen side might pay off in the future by taking and then having an isolated pawn. But remember, this is the Panov. The exchange variation does not have c4, so you can get a very similar looking position, and here either develop standard or, as Gotham said, fianchetto, right? You have 2 options here. But then there's even some more, but this is the very easy thing to do is when they exchange your pawn. And the last thing that you need to worry about in the Caro-Kann defense is what if they leave this here? Now, if they leave it here and it's free, like this, I don't know, take it, develop your pieces, don't block in your bishop, play normal chess. There are two ways that they can defend this normally. Number one is with this knight. Number two is the fantasy variation with the f-pawn. The fantasy variation scores very well against the Caro-Kann. The knight, d2 or knight c3, doesn't really matter. You're going to take. I do not recommend taking against the fantasy because this will allow white to have a big fat center. So there's no need to allow white to get everything they want. You should be confrontational. You shouldn't be a pushover. In this case, it doesn't matter that the knight is here because it's not really scaring anybody. So you both have lost the center pawn. There are two approaches as far as I'm concerned in the classical variation. When they defend the pawn with the knight, it's known as the classical. In this position, knight f6 or bishop to f5, immediately challenging that knight makes sense. I actually think this variation, immediately attacking with the knight, is super simple to play, and what I'm about to show you, I guarantee will happen in one of your games. Of course, if they don't take you, you have to develop normally. There's really not too much we can do here. You're gonna have to develop bishop, knight, maybe here, utilize an E or C pawn break to open your position in the future, develop, castle. But if they take you, I like to take with the E pawn, and now the game plan's very simple. Bishop out, castle. Okay, so bishop out. Now, in this position, maybe don't castle, because you'll hang mate, but obviously, if they do that, you'll attack their queen and then castle. But after you get this, these pieces will move as follows. Slide the rook over to fight for the e-file. Okay, the knight slides where the rook was. You actually transfer the knight over to the king side, and you're very solid. Plus, when the knight is on f8, it will constantly defend h7, from where you will never be checkmated. The Tartakower, truthfully, is a little bit of a difficult one to play. It's also not super common. But you're going to have to deal with it every now and then. Your alternative is to play the classical variation with bishop to f5. After bishop to f5, there is some theory. You need to get your bishop out of the way. If the opponent does this, you need to not get your bishop trapped. This is all in the description, by the way. And theory looks like this. It's a super theoretical position. But if you just want a very easy variation to play against the classical, I think the Tartakower is a good way to go. We haven't looked at the fantasy. The fantasy, in my opinion, I think you should play it like this. I think g6 is a very practical weapon against the fantasy, and you just don't let them bully you. So you'll play bishop to g7, and if the bishop develops early, you will slide your queen out to b6 and actually just go for b2. There is a tricky line here with queen d2, but you're completely safe. You can take an escape, not a problem. And the second white does something with this pawn, you immediately pounce. So for example, you can actually develop. You don't even need to take back because you already won a pawn, right? This is all in the description for you. This is actually all kind of cutting edge theory. It's been played many times. And if white shoves this pawn forward, well, that's fantastic. We can attack it with f6. A move like f6, get our knight out. And if they defend it, then you can even slide the knight out to f5. You have experience moving the knight to f5 because you've done it in the advanced variation. The fantasy is tricky, but by the way, there's also like very tricky lines like e5. The point of e5 is that if they take, your bishop and queen can swarm this diagonal. Very tricky line, not the best by theory, but you can play like this, and this is pretty terrifying for white. For example, game can end with knight e2, check here, mate. So the fantasy is tricky, but if you find a way to attack them and create an attack on their king because they weaken it a little bit early with this f-pawn push, be my guest. Beyond that, there's a few other variations that are not super popular. There is the two knights. If you want to play the two knights, pin the knight, and then very simply, like if they attack you, you trade it just like in the advance and regroup on the light squares. You can even do this. And now you have 7 pawns on light squares, and now you've unlocked like a hidden gem. You have all 8 pawns on light squares because you traded your light square bishop. Two knights Caro-Kann, not super popular. You can always just, like I said, play the Tartakower, but it's seen a decent amount at the high levels. And everything else is a major sideline. For example, you might experience this in the wild. Okay, go review with an opening database. Go review with, you know, some sort of engine after the game is done. Try to play reasonable, logical chess, and don't just go completely insane.